The first time I received a violation notice from the homeowner association, I thought it was a mistake. A piece of paper tucked neatly into my mailbox, stamped with an official-looking emblem, informing me that my unauthorized garden installation was in direct violation of community regulations. I laughed. It was just a garden. A few planter boxes, some herbs, tomatoes, and wildflowers. Nothing excessive, certainly nothing worth an official warning, but the second notice wasn't so funny. Nor was the $500 fine attached to it. When I moved to Maplewood Estates 6 months ago, I had no idea I was stepping into a community where growing your own food was an act of defiance. The houses here were picture perfect, the streets pristine, the lawns manicured to perfection. It was the kind of place people aspired to live in, safe, orderly, uniform, and uniformity was the problem. "You'll need to remove it," Karen said, standing at the edge of my driveway. I had met her within days of moving in. Mid-50s, short blonde bob, the kind of woman whose presence made you feel like you were being graded. I had noticed how the other neighbors behaved around her. Too polite, slightly stiff, as if walking on eggshells. "It's just a garden," I replied, brushing soil off my hands. "It's against the rules," she said, her voice clipped, her tone absolute. "Whose rules?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "The homeowner association's. Regulation 14.3. No unauthorized modifications to front yards. You agreed to it when you bought the house." "What if I move it to the backyard?" I asked. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That would be acceptable. For now." I didn't like the way she said it. For now. That night I sat at my kitchen table flipping through the HOA guidelines. 56 pages of restrictions, fines, and penalties for infractions as minor as leaving a trash can out past collection day. It was absurd. I had always thought homeowner associations were just neighborhood busybodies with too much time on their hands. I didn't realize they had actual power, legal power, to fine, harass, and even foreclose on homes if violations weren't corrected. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about my garden. This was about control. The next morning, I found another notice taped to my front door. The fine had doubled, and someone had trampled my tomato plants. I wasn't naive. I knew when a battle line was being drawn. This wasn't about an unsightly lawn or community standards. It was about compliance. I wasn't following the unspoken rules of submission, and that made me a problem. I decided to fight back. I reached out to a local lawyer, a friend of a friend, to ask about my rights. He confirmed my suspicions. HOAs had more power than most people realized, but there were loopholes. I started researching cases where homeowners had successfully pushed back against their HOAs and found that the key was public pressure. So I started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every passive-aggressive comment from Karen, every neighbor who expressed sympathy but was too afraid to speak up, I kept a record of it all. And then, late one night, I got a knock on my door. I checked my watch, nearly midnight. Through the peephole, I saw a figure in the shadows. I hesitated before opening the door, but my curiosity got the better of me. It was an older man, mid-70s, thin and weary-looking. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking in a low voice. "You need to be careful," he said. "They don't like people asking questions." "Who are you?" I asked. He exhaled heavily. "Name's Grant. I used to live 3 houses down. Had a shed in my backyard, just a small one, nothing fancy. They told me it was against regulations. Fined me until I couldn't keep up. Had to sell my home." He shook his head. "They pushed me out. Like they push everyone out when they want to." A chill ran down my spine. "Why?" His gaze hardened. "Because there's something buried under this neighborhood they don't want anyone digging up." That was the moment everything changed. This wasn't about my garden anymore. This was about something much, much bigger. I barely slept that night. Every creak of my house, every rustling of the wind outside made my pulse quicken. Grant's warning had shaken me. There was something buried beneath this neighborhood. Something the homeowner association didn't want anyone to find. But what? The next morning, I walked my property, scanning the ground with fresh eyes. There was nothing remarkable about it. Just my half-trampled garden, the ruined tomato plants, and the absurdly pristine, identical lawns of my neighbors. But as I stared at my front yard, something nagged at me. Why had the HOA gone after me so aggressively? I'd seen people break the rules before, leaving their garbage cans out overnight, hosting noisy gatherings, but they only got slaps on the wrist. What was different about me? The answer came unexpectedly. Later that afternoon, while I was still fuming over my latest fine, I saw a woman standing at the edge of my yard. I recognized her immediately. Linda, from 2 streets over. She was a single mother of 2, had lived in Maplewood Estates for nearly 10 years. "You should have just taken it down," she said, her voice low. I tensed. "You mean the garden?" She nodded, glancing around before stepping closer. "They're watching you. They always watch the ones who don't fall in line." "Who, the HOA?" Linda hesitated before answering. "Yes, but it's not just them." Her words sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "What do you mean?" She exhaled sharply. "I shouldn't even be talking to you, but I know what you're feeling. The fines, the notices, the threats, they make your life a living hell until you give up and leave. And if you don't—" She swallowed hard, looking away. "People disappear." A chill ran down my spine. "Disappear? Like Grant?" Her eyes flicked back to mine, widening slightly. "You talked to Grant? He showed up at my house last night, told me he was forced out, that there was something buried under the neighborhood." She paled. "He shouldn't have done that. They don't like people digging too deep." "Who are they?" I demanded. She shook her head. "I've already said too much. Just be careful." And with that, she hurried away, leaving me more unsettled than ever. I spent the next few days watching Karen, watching the HOA board members, watching the seemingly perfect mundane life of Maplewood Estates. But now, I saw it differently. The rigid perfection wasn't normal. It was orchestrated, controlled. And then, late one evening, I found it. I had been walking around the edge of my property when I noticed something odd. A slight depression in the ground near my garden, like the soil had been disturbed. Kneeling down, I brushed away the dirt, my fingers scraping against something solid. Plastic. Heart hammering, I dug deeper, revealing what looked like a heavy-duty tarp buried beneath the grass. My breath came short as I pulled at it, the fabric stiff with age. As I peeled it back, I uncovered something I hadn't expected. Rusty metal barrels. There were at least 3 of them. Their surfaces corroded, the lids sealed shut. But one had a small puncture near the top, and from it, a thick, dark sludge had leaked into the surrounding soil. The smell hit me immediately. Chemical, acrid, unnatural. This was it. This was what they didn't want me to find. I barely had time to process what I had uncovered before I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. My stomach dropped. "You shouldn't have done that." I turned sharply. Karen stood a few feet away, her face cast in shadow under the dim porch lights. She wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't pretending to be the friendly neighborhood enforcer. She looked dangerous. "What the hell is this?" I asked, stepping in front of the barrels protectively. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with," she said. "Cover it back up. Forget you saw anything." I let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Are you serious? This is a toxic waste dump. This stuff has been leaking into the ground, into the water supply." She took a slow step closer. "It's been handled, and it's not your problem." "Like hell it isn't," I snapped. "People live here. There are kids here. This is criminal." Karen exhaled through her nose. "That's the problem with people like you. Always thinking you can fight the system." I squared my shoulders. "And what happens if I don't back down? What if I go public with this?" Karen didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled something out of her jacket pocket and tossed it onto the ground at my feet. A single, crumpled piece of paper. I bent down, unfolding it with shaky fingers. My stomach dropped when I saw what it was. An eviction notice. Effective immediately. "You have 24 hours to leave," Karen said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Or we make things difficult." I looked up at her, fury bubbling under my skin. "You think I'm just going to roll over and let you bury this?" For the first time, Karen's lips curled into a small, cold smile. "I think you're out of options." And then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the dark, my heart pounding, the barrels of toxic waste still glistening in the dim light. I had uncovered the truth. But now, the real fight was about to begin. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those rusted barrels, the thick sludge oozing into the soil, seeping into the ground beneath every perfect, manicured lawn in Maplewood Estates. By morning, my resolve was set. They weren't going to scare me off. Not Karen, not the homeowner association, not whatever faceless entity had buried those barrels in the first place. The problem was I was running out of time. First, I took photos. Every angle, every barrel, every patch of contaminated soil I could capture. Then I backed them up to 3 different locations: my phone, my laptop, and a secure drive online. If anything happened, at least the evidence wouldn't disappear with me. Then I called the EPA. "Sir, can you confirm the exact location?" the woman on the other end asked. "Yes," I said, rattling off my address. "There are metal barrels buried on my property, leaking some kind of chemical into the ground. I think it's been there for years." There was a pause. "We take environmental violations very seriously, but we'll need confirmation. Can you provide documentation?" "I have photos. I can send them now." "Please do. I'll escalate this, but these things take time." "I don't have time," I snapped, then forced myself to take a breath. "The homeowner association already knows I found them. They served me an eviction notice last night." Another pause. "Sir, are you in immediate danger?" I glanced out the window, half expecting to see Karen watching from the street. "I don't know, but I think they're trying to cover this up." "We'll investigate, Mr. Carter, but please be careful." I hung up, a knot tightening in my chest. "Be careful." That was all they could say. I needed to do more. I spent the next few hours knocking on doors. I knew my neighbors weren't blind. Some of them had to suspect something was off. Most refused to talk. Some barely cracked their doors open before shaking their heads. "I don't want trouble," one man muttered before slamming it shut. But Linda was different. She let me in, locking the door behind us. "I was afraid they'd come after you," she said, wringing her hands. "After what happened to Grant." I leaned forward. What had happened to Grant? She hesitated, then sighed. Grant was the last one who tried to push back against the HOA. He started asking questions about why people kept, voluntarily, selling their homes and moving away. About why the water tasted strange sometimes. He filed a complaint. A week later, his house was suddenly foreclosed. "That's not legal," I said. She scoffed. "You think they care about legal? The HOA controls everything here. They work with city officials. They can make anything look official." I swallowed hard. "Linda, this is bigger than just shady real estate deals. I found the barrels. They're leaking. This could be poisoning all of us." Her face paled. "Oh my God." I nodded. "We have to go public. Call the news. Make this impossible to ignore." She was shaking. "If we do that, they'll come after us." I knew she was right, but we didn't have a choice. I sent the photos to every local news outlet I could think of. I even emailed a few national reporters. Then I waited. Hours passed. My phone stayed silent. Then, finally, an email came through. Subject, RE, Urgent Environmental Hazard in Maplewood Estates. "Mr. Carter, thank you for reaching out. Your claims are highly concerning, and we are forwarding this to our investigative team. Someone will be in touch soon. Please do not delete any documentation. If possible, avoid confrontation with local authorities until our reporters can verify your claims. Best, Sarah Langley, Investigative Correspondent." I exhaled in relief. At least someone was listening. But then the doorbell rang. I glanced at Linda. "You expecting someone?" She shook her head, her face tense. I moved to the door and peered through the peephole. Karen stood outside, flanked by 2 men in dark suits. My stomach dropped. This isn't good. I opened the door, keeping it only slightly ajar. "What do you want?" Karen's usual smug expression was gone. "We need to talk." I don't think we do. One of the men spoke up, his voice deep and authoritative. Mr. Carter, we strongly advise you to drop this matter, for your own good. A cold sweat broke over my skin. Who are you? Concerned parties, the man said simply. Linda gripped my arm. Don't listen to them. Karen sighed, shaking her head. Look, you're making this harder than it needs to be. The barrels? None of your business. The eviction? Already in motion. But if you just walk away now, we can make this easy. I clenched my jaw. And if I don't? Karen's smile returned, but this time it was icy. Then things get difficult. The man in the suit handed me an envelope. Final warning. I shut the door in their faces. I ripped open the envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter. It threatened legal action, financial penalties, even a restraining order if I continued my defamatory accusations against the homeowner association. I read the last line twice. Failure to comply will result in escalated corrective measures. I turned to Linda. They're scared. If they weren't, they wouldn't be trying this hard to shut me up. She nodded, but fear still clouded her eyes. But what are they willing to do if this doesn't work? I didn't have an answer. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The moment I slammed the door shut, I knew the game had changed. I had crossed a line, and now the homeowner association, or whoever was really behind them, was done pretending. They wanted me gone, and they weren't going to wait around for legal proceedings to do it. Linda sat on the couch, clutching her hands together, her face pale. What do we do now? I paced the room, my mind racing. We doubled down. They wouldn't be threatening me like this if they weren't afraid. We need to push this into the public eye before they make their next move. Linda hesitated. What if they... A loud thud against the front door cut her off. We both jumped, my stomach twisted. I crept to the peephole. The two men in suits were gone, but something had been left on my doorstep. A dead bird. Its neck was twisted unnaturally, its glassy eyes staring up at me. Linda gasped. Oh my God! My hands clenched into fists. They're trying to scare me. She shook her head. It's working. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow seemed like a threat. I had heard stories of HOA harassment, but this was something else entirely. By morning, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for their next move. I needed to take the fight to them. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First to the investigative reporter who had responded to my emails. Sarah, it's worse than I thought. They threatened me last night. Left a dead animal at my door. There was a pause on the other end. That's serious. Listen, I'm pulling some strings to get my team out there as soon as possible. But Carter, be careful. If they're willing to go this far, I know, that's why I need to move fast. I hung up and dialed the EPA again. This time I didn't bother with the automated system. I demanded to speak to someone higher up. Sir, we understand the urgency of your claim, the agent said, but these investigations take time. People could be drinking contaminated water right now. There's a chemical leak beneath this neighborhood and the HOA is actively covering it up. We'll escalate your complaint immediately. That wasn't enough. I needed something bigger. That evening I made my move. Karen and the other HOA board members always held their meetings in the community center, a pristine, beige-bricked building that looked like it had never been touched by anything as real as dirt. I knew they kept records there, the ones they didn't want anyone to see. Linda was dead set against the plan. This is insane, she whispered as we crouched near the back entrance. If they catch us... We're already past that point, I whispered back. I just need 10 minutes. Watch my back. The lock was surprisingly easy to pick, almost like they'd never expected anyone to break in. Inside, the air was cool, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, a stark contrast to the sleek digital monitors on the main desk. I started digging. Minutes ticked by as I rifled through folders, scanning property records, financial statements, anything that could give me leverage. Then I found it. A contract between Maplewood Estates HOA and a company called Greenridge Environmental Solutions, a company with a history of illegally dumping hazardous waste. I barely had time to process what I was holding before I heard footsteps outside. Linda's frantic whisper cut through the quiet. "Someone's coming!" I shoved the documents into my jacket and slid the filing drawer shut just as the door creaked open. Karen walked in, her expression sharp as steel. "I knew you wouldn't let this go." Behind her, 2 men, probably the same ones who had delivered my warning, stepped inside, blocking the exit. "You think you're smart?" Karen sneered. "Breaking in? Stealing documents? What exactly do you think you're going to do with them?" I straightened. "Expose you. Expose all of you. The environmental violations, the corruption, the way you push people out of their homes." She laughed. "And who's going to believe you? Some bitter homeowner with a grudge? We have connections. We have influence. You have nothing." I took a slow step forward. "I have the press, I have the EPA, and I have proof." Her smug expression faltered, just a fraction. "It's over, Karen." For the first time, I saw something new in her face. Fear. We barely made it out of the community center before the sirens cut through the night. Linda and I ran. We sprinted across the neighborhood, dodging through backyards, avoiding streetlights. The documents burned against my skin, every piece of paper in my pocket a ticking bomb. By the time I reached my house, my phone was buzzing with messages. One from Sarah, the journalist. "We're running the story tomorrow. Hold tight." One from an unknown number. "You should have walked away." And one from an EPA agent. "We're sending a team out immediately. Do not leave town." I sank into a chair, my body shaking with adrenaline. I had won. But at what cost? The next morning, Maplewood Estates was swarmed with government agents, journalists, and camera crews. The HOA board members were being questioned, and for the first time, the neighborhood wasn't under their control. Karen was nowhere to be found. I should have felt relieved, vindicated. But as I stood there, watching my neighbors whisper among themselves, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Because if there was one thing I had learned, it was that people like Karen always had a backup plan. The morning after the news broke, Maplewood Estates felt like a war zone. Government agents roamed the streets, inspecting yards, speaking with homeowners. Camera crews set up at the entrance of the neighborhood, capturing footage of the once pristine community now tainted by scandal. Some neighbors whispered in hushed voices, others outright avoided me. I couldn't blame them. I had torn apart the illusion they had built their lives around. Karen was still missing. The last time anyone saw her was the night before, after our confrontation in the community center. Some believed she had fled, others thought she was hiding, waiting for the chaos to die down. But I wasn't convinced she was gone for good. The EPA wasted no time getting to work. The barrels I had uncovered were just the beginning. As teams dug deeper, they found more. Some buried beneath sidewalks, others hidden under the very foundations of homes. Years of toxic waste, poisoning the land, seeping into the water. The scale of the cover-up was unimaginable. A federal investigation was officially launched against the Homeowner Association. Several board members had already been detained for questioning, though most claimed ignorance. But the paper trail I had stolen from the HOA offices told a different story. They had known all along. And Karen, she had been at the center of it. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt safe. But the reality was, I had made dangerous enemies. 2 nights after the EPA teams arrived, my house was broken into. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. My heart pounded as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and crept downstairs. The living room window was smashed. Papers from my investigation were strewn across the floor. The documents I had hidden were gone. But whoever had broken in wasn't just after evidence. They wanted to send a message. Scrawled across my wall in red spray paint were 3 words: "Leave or else." The police arrived within minutes, but I could already see how this would play out. They took my statement, nodded sympathetically, but there was little they could do. "Could be a random act of vandalism," one officer said. "Hard to prove otherwise." I knew better. Linda was the first to check on me. "You need to leave, Carter. They're not going to stop." I shook my head. "I can't just run." "You did your part. The EPA is here, the investigation is happening. You don't need to be the one to see it through. But I did need to, because I knew deep down that this wasn't over. Karen was still out there, and as long as she was, I wasn't safe. It happened the next evening. I had just returned home when I saw a shadow move near my backyard. My pulse spiked as I stepped onto the porch, gripping the bat tightly. "I know you're there," I called out. "Show yourself." A figure emerged from the darkness. Karen. She looked different, disheveled, paranoid. Her usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by something desperate. "You ruined everything," she hissed. I held my ground. "You did that yourself." She took a step closer, her eyes wild. "You don't understand. You think this ends with me? There are bigger players involved, people you can't touch. You have no idea what you've uncovered." I swallowed hard. "Then tell me." She laughed bitterly. "You think they're going to let this go public? The HOA, the city, the developers, they've all been in on it for years. You're not a hero, Carter. You're just a loose end." I tightened my grip on the bat. "Then why are you here?" Her expression darkened. "To make sure you stay quiet." She lunged. I barely had time to react. The fight was messy, desperate. She clawed at me, trying to wrestle the bat from my hands. We slammed into the side of the house, knocking over patio furniture. I struggled to push her off, but she was relentless. Then, suddenly, a loud crack filled the air. Karen went still. Her eyes widened as she staggered back, gripping her side. Blood seeped through her jacket. Linda stood behind her, a small pistol shaking in her hands. She had a knife," she stammered. "I didn't know what else to do." Karen slumped to the ground, gasping. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then her body went limp. It was over. The police came, statements were given. Linda was taken in for questioning, but it was clear she had acted in self-defense. The media frenzy only grew. With Karen gone, the remaining HOA board members scrambled to save themselves, cutting deals to reduce their sentences. The entire neighborhood was thrown into chaos as the full scope of the cover-up came to light. Within a month, Maplewood Estates was no longer under HOA control. The toxic waste removal process had begun, and lawsuits were piling up against the developers responsible. And me? I left. Not because I was afraid, but because there was nothing left for me here. Linda and I kept in touch. She ended up moving too, starting fresh in a place without HOA nightmares. As for Maplewood Estates, it would never be the same. The illusion was shattered, and no amount of forced uniformity could ever bring it back. Some battles, you fight for yourself. Others, you fight to make sure no one else has to. And I had won.